My name is Charlotte, and for the first 18 years of my life, the most important decision I ever made was whether to use lye soap or sand to scrub the soot from the great hall's hearth. I was a servant, invisible, and that was safe. But everything changed the day. A man with eyes like a winter storm told me I had to become a princess to stop a war. He was a knight, bound by duty, and I was just a girl who looked like a ghost. He forced me into a world of silk gowns and poisoned words, and the most dangerous part wasn't the court politics or the constant fear of being discovered. It was him. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, the way his duty and his heart were at war, just like the kingdoms we were trying to save. I never expected that the greatest battle I'd fight would be for a love that was strictly heartbreakingly forbidden. Before I dive into the story of how a scullery maid ended up negotiating a peace treaty, let me know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. It's amazing to think how far a story can travel, and if you've ever felt like you were wearing a mask, pretending to be someone you're not just to survive, go ahead and hit that like button. You're not alone. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the mud and the smoke, long before the marble and the gold. The day my life ended and began, it smelled of rain and horses. I was kneeling in the damp earth behind the kitchens of Baron Fowwick's estate, pulling up stubborn winter carrots from the unforgiving soil. My knuckles were raw, my fingernails were permanently packed with dirt, and a smear of mud decorated my cheek. This was my world, the sting of the cold, the ache in my lower back, and the simple, honest work of feeding a household. I was nobody of consequence, a forgotten orphan left on the Baron's doorstep as an infant, raised by the kitchen staff to earn my keep. My future was a straight, unbranching line of more carrots, more hearths to scrub, more laundry to pound against river stones. It was not a grand life, but it was mine, and it was predictable. Then the horses arrived, not the plodding draft horses of the estate, but magnificent war horses, their coats gleaming like polished jet even in the overcast light. They stamped and snorted, their breath pluming in the chill air, their riders sitting tall and rigid in the saddle. At their head was a man who seemed carved from the northern mountains themselves. He wore the silver and cobalt blue of the king's royal guard, his armor immaculate save for the dust of a long journey. A heavy cloak was clasped at his shoulder, and his expression was as hard and unyielding as his steel breastplate. This was Sir Calin. I did not know his name then, of course. To me he was just a terrifyingly important man who had no business being near the kitchens. We all scurried out of the way, the other servants and I, pressing ourselves against the stone walls like mice hiding from a hawk. But his eyes, a startling pale gray, swept over the yard and inexplicably, impossibly, landed on me. They narrowed. For a heart-stopping moment, I was certain I had done something wrong. Was there a new tax I hadn't heard of? Had I accidentally used the Baron's personal linen to wipe down a table? My mind raced through a litany of minor sins, each one feeling like a capital offense under that intense gaze. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his armored boots thudding softly on the packed earth. He handed his reins to another soldier without looking and began to walk towards me. Not towards the kitchen master, not towards the steward, but directly towards me. The other servants melted away, leaving me exposed and trembling. I wanted to run, to burrow into the ground like a frightened rabbit, but I was frozen to the spot, a half-pulled carrot still clutched in my hand. "Your name," he commanded. His voice was deep and resonant, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was not a question, it was a demand for information. "Charlotte, sir," I whispered, my voice barely a squeak. I tried to curtsy, a clumsy, awkward gesture while kneeling in the mud. He stopped a few feet from me, his shadow falling over me, blocking out the weak afternoon sun. He studied my face, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. It moved over my brow, my nose, the shape of my mouth, the line of my jaw. I felt my cheeks burn with a mixture of fear and humiliation. No one had ever looked at me so closely before. I was used to being overlooked, to being a part of the scenery. To be seen like this was unnerving, invasive. "Look at me," he said, his voice softer this time, but no less commanding. I forced myself to lift my head, to meet those stormy eyes. A strange expression flickered across his face, something I couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't cruelty. It was something closer to disbelief, mingled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. It was the look of a man who had searched for something for a very long time, and upon finding it wished that he hadn't. He reached out a gloved hand, and I flinched violently, convinced he was going to strike me. He froze, his hand hovering in the air between us. "I am not going to harm you," he said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. He slowly, deliberately, tucked a stray strand of my mousy brown hair behind my ear. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, the cold leather of his glove, a strange contrast to the warmth that flared on my skin. The resemblance is uncanny. I had no idea what he was talking about. I was just Charlotte. I looked like myself. I had a small, upturned nose, a smattering of freckles from the rare days the sun shone, and eyes that were the color of moss after a rain. My only remarkable feature was one I kept hidden, a small, crescent moon-shaped birthmark just below my left collarbone. He straightened up and turned to the Baron, who had finally bustled out of the keep, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and fear. "My Lord Baron," Sir Caelan said, his voice once again hard as iron, "by order of His Majesty King Theron, this girl is coming with me." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my fear. "Coming with you? Where?" "I've done nothing wrong, sir. I swear it." I scrambled to my feet, clutching the muddy carrot to my chest like a shield. The Baron sputtered, "Sir Caelan, she is but a scullery maid, an orphan. Of what possible use could she be to the king?" Sir Caelan turned his head just enough to pin the Baron with a look that could have frozen fire. "That is the king's business, not yours. Pack her things." He glanced at my ragged tunic and muddy skirts. "No, do not. We will provide for her. Have her washed and brought to the main gate in 1 hour." He turned and strode back to his men. Without another word, the matter settled. I was left standing in the mud, my world tilting on its axis. Washed, bundled into a spare but clean woolen dress, I was led to the gate like a lamb to the slaughter. My friends from the kitchen watched from a distance, their faces pale with worry. They were my only family, and I was being torn away from them without reason or explanation. The kitchen master, a gruff but kind man named Thomas, pressed a small, lumpy apple into my hand as I passed. "For the road," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. It was a gesture of such profound kindness in that moment of terror that tears pricked my eyes. Sir Caelan was waiting, already mounted. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable. Another soldier helped me onto a small, steady mare. I had never been on a horse before, and I clung to the reins with white-knuckled desperation. "Where are you taking me?" I asked again, my voice trembling. He nudged his horse alongside mine, "To the capital, to Valoria." "But why?" I pleaded. "Please, just tell me why." He was silent for a long moment, guiding his horse through the gates and onto the main road, his guards falling into formation around us. The estate I had known my entire life shrank behind us. Finally he spoke, his voice low so only I could hear. 10 years ago, Princess Aurelia, the king's only child and heir, vanished from the palace. She was presumed taken, or worse. Without a clear heir, the kingdom has been unstable ever since. Our neighbors in Viridia see our weakness. Their king, a belligerent old hawk, is rattling his sabers at our border, claiming an old blood debt gives him rights to our northern territories. Our only chance for peace is to honor the betrothal contract that was signed before the princess disappeared, a marriage between our heir and their Prince Alaric. I stared at him, my mind a whirl of confusion. What does any of that have to do with me? He finally looked at me again, and the weariness I had seen before was back, etched into every line of his face. You, Charlotte, are the spitting image of how Princess Aurelia would look today. The same eyes, the same hair color, the same jawline. You even have the same crescent-shaped birthmark on your collarbone, a detail known only to a handful of us who were in her royal confidence. My hand flew to my neck, covering the mark that I had always thought was just a random imperfection. A cold dread, far deeper than simple fear, began to snake its way through my veins. I understood now. It wasn't a punishment, it was something far, far worse. You are going to become Princess Aurelia, he stated, each word a heavy stone dropped into the quiet of my soul. You will present yourself at court. You will charm the Viridian envoy, Prince Alaric. You will convince everyone that the lost princess has returned. You will do this to prevent a war that would cost thousands of lives. You will do this for your kingdom. His gaze hardened. You do not have a choice. The journey to Valoria was a blur of misery and grueling instruction. We rode hard from dawn until dusk, stopping only for brief, functional meals of hard bread and dried meat. Every night, while his men made camp, Sir Kellen would drill me. He was a relentless, unforgiving teacher. We sat by the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows around us, and he would pour the life of a girl I had never met into my head. Princess Aurelia's favorite horse was a white mare named Zephyr, he'd say, his voice a monotone drone. Her best friend was Lady Beatrice, who died of a fever 5 years ago. You will need to express sadness when her name is mentioned. Her favorite tutor was Master Valerius, who is now a duke and a key member of the King's Council. He will be the hardest to deceive. He taught you history. What were the key points of the Sunstone Treaty of the Third Age? I would stumble, my mind numb with exhaustion. I don't, sir. I scrubbed floors. We never talked about treaties. His eyes would flash with impatience. That is no longer your reality. You are a princess. You have studied these things your entire life. Now again, the Sunstone Treaty. He was merciless. He made me practice walking, talking, eating. He corrected my posture with a sharp tap of his finger on my spine. He made me repeat phrases in the high, formal court dialect until my tongue was thick and clumsy in my mouth. Not yes, your highness, he would snap. It is indeed your majesty, or, as you command, your grace. Precision is everything. A single slip could get us both executed. One evening, my frustration and fear boiled over. He was quizzing me on the royal lineage, a dizzying tapestry of names and titles that all sounded the same to me. I gave a wrong answer, confusing a third cousin with a great uncle. No, he barked, slamming a leather-bound book shut. Wrong. That is utterly wrong. King Theron's great-aunt married into the House of Bryn, not the House of Thorn. A simple mistake like that in front of Duke Valerius, and he will have you in the dungeons before you can blink. Are you even listening? Tears of pure exhaustion and rage sprang to my eyes. I am trying, I cried, my voice cracking. Do you think this is easy for me? 1 week ago, my biggest worry was a pot boiling over. Now you want me to know the family tree of every noble in the kingdom. I don't know these people. This is not my life. He stared at me, his jaw tight. For a moment I thought he might finally show some flicker of sympathy. Instead, his expression grew even colder. I do not care if it is easy, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I care if it is convincing. Men are gathering on our borders, Charlotte. They are sharpening swords and fletching arrows. Farmers are being pulled from their fields to be handed a spear. Their lives, the lives of your countrymen, depend on how well you learn this part. So you will sit here, and you will learn the royal lineage until you can recite it in your sleep. Your comfort is not my concern. The safety of the realm is. His words were like a slap. He was right, of course. The stakes were impossibly high, but his coldness, his complete dismissal of my terror, hurt more than I wanted to admit. He wasn't just a knight following orders, he was my jailer, my tormentor. He saw me not as a person, but as a tool, a key to lock a door against the horrors of war, a necessary deception. It was in that moment, huddled by the fire under his relentless gaze, that I began to truly hate Sir Kalen. Yet, there were other moments, small cracks in his armored facade, that I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, my horse stumbled on a loose rock, and I was thrown. I landed hard, the air knocked from my lungs, my ankle twisting beneath me. Before I could even process the pain, Kalen was off his horse, and by my side. He knelt in the dirt, his movements swift and efficient as he examined my ankle. "Can you move it?" he asked, his voice laced with an uncharacteristic urgency. His hands were surprisingly gentle as they probed the swelling. I winced, shaking my head. The pain was a sharp, white-hot lance shooting up my leg. Without another word, he scooped me up into his arms. I was shocked by the ease with which he lifted me, my head ending up tucked against his chest. I could hear the steady, strong beat of his heart through the layers of leather and steel. He carried me to the side of the road and set me down carefully, then proceeded to tear a strip from his own cloak to bind my ankle. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his stern mouth set in a thin line. He didn't speak, but his actions were more eloquent than words. He was worried, not just about the mission, I thought, but about me. For a fleeting instant as he tightened the makeshift bandage, his thumb brushed against the sensitive skin of my inner ankle, and a jolt, entirely separate from the pain, shot through me. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his composure snapping back into place. "It is a sprain, nothing more," he said gruffly, standing up and dusting off his hands. "You will ride with me for the rest of the day." He wouldn't look at me. He simply lifted me onto his massive warhorse, placing me in front of him in the saddle, and we continued on. I spent the rest of that day pressed against his chest, intensely aware of the solid wall of his body behind me, the warmth that seeped through his armor, and the subtle scent of leather, steel, and pine that clung to him. I hated him for his cruelty, but in those quiet moments, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, a different, more confusing emotion began to take root in my heart. We arrived at the gates of Valoria at dusk. The city was a sprawling behemoth of white stone and slate roofs, far grander and more intimidating than anything I could have ever imagined. We didn't enter through the main gates. Kalen led us through a series of winding back streets to a small, discreet postern gate in the palace wall. We were met by a single, elderly woman with a severe face and iron gray hair pulled into a tight bun. This was Elspeth, the princess's former governess, one of the few people in on the conspiracy. She looked me up and down, her thin lips pressed together in a line of disapproval. "She has the face," she conceded, her voice dry as dust. "But she has the posture of a laundress. We have much work to do." The next 2 weeks were an even more intense form of torture than the journey. I was kept in a secluded set of chambers in a forgotten wing of the palace. My days were a relentless schedule of lessons. Elspeth drilled me on etiquette, from which of the 12 forks to use for shellfish, to the precise angle at which to bow to a visiting dignitary. A sour-faced tutor was brought in to teach me the histories and languages Aurelia would have known. A prim dance master tried in vain to teach my clumsy feet the intricate steps of the courtly gavotte. Kalen was a constant, looming presence. He observed every lesson, his arms crossed over his chest, his gray eyes missing nothing. He rarely spoke, but his silent judgment was more unnerving than any verbal critique. He was the architect of this lie, and he watched its construction with the grim focus of a master builder. My only respite was with the young seamstress sent to create my new wardrobe. Her name was Lyra. She was quiet and gentle, with kind eyes and nimble fingers. Unlike everyone else, she didn't try to change me. She simply took my measurements, her touch light and professional, and spoke to me in a soft, soothing voice about the silks from the south and the velvets from the north. She was the first person in weeks who had treated me like a human being, not a project. The night before I was to be presented to the king, Kalen came to my chambers. I was sitting by the window staring out at the labyrinth of palace rooftops, feeling sick with dread. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me. "Are you ready?" he asked. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. Ready to lie to a grieving father? Ready to deceive an entire kingdom? How could anyone be ready for that? I turned to face him, letting all my fear and resentment show. What if he doesn't believe me? What if he sees the truth in my eyes? That I'm just a girl who belongs in a kitchen, not on a throne. He walked further into the room, his expression uncharacteristically soft in the candlelight. "He wants to believe you," he said quietly. "The king is a man drowning in grief and political pressure. You are the hand he is reaching for. You just have to be convincing enough for him to grab hold." He stopped in front of me, so close I could see the flicker of the candle flame reflected in his eyes. "I know what I have asked of you is a monstrous thing, Charlotte. I know I have forced you, and I have been harsh." He seemed to struggle with the words. "I do it because the alternative is so much worse. I have seen war. I have seen what it does to villages, to families. I am trying to prevent that, but the burden of it has fallen upon you. For that, I am truly sorry." It was the first time he had offered anything close to an apology. The sincerity in his voice disarmed me completely. The anger I had been nursing for weeks seemed to dissolve, replaced by a weary understanding. We were both just pieces in a game much larger than ourselves. "The real princess," I whispered. "What was she like?" A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of genuine personal pain. "She was bright," he said, his voice barely audible. "Like the sun, fearless. She used to climb the castle walls. She could ride better than most of my squires. She was kind, but she had a fierce will. She hated the stuffiness of the court." He paused. "She would have hated this deception, but she would have understood the necessity." He had been her personal guard, I realized. His devotion wasn't just to the crown, it was to the memory of the girl he had failed to protect. My heart ached for him, for the king, for the lost girl named Aurelia. "I will do my best," I said, and for the first time, I truly meant it. He nodded, a sharp, single dip of his head. He reached out, as if to touch my shoulder, but then his hand dropped back to his side. The space between us crackled with unspoken words, with the impossible weight of our shared secret. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice once again, that of the stoic knight, "you must be perfect." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the ghosts of a princess and the terrifying prospect of meeting a king. The meeting with King Theron took place in his private solar, a room filled with maps, books, and the heavy scent of old grief. Kylan and Elspeth led me in. The king was standing by a large window, his back to us, looking out over the city. He was slighter than I imagined, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his ermine-trimmed robes. When he finally turned, I saw a man hollowed out by loss. His eyes, the same mossy green as my own, were sunken and haunted. He looked at me, and his breath hitched. He took a tentative step forward, then another. Kaelin had been right. This man didn't want to see a fraud. He was desperate for a miracle. He scanned my face, his own filled with a painful, fragile hope. "Aurelia?" he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. My throat was dry as sand. All the lines Elspeth had coached me to say, all the prepared speeches, evaporated from my mind. I could only see a father who had lost his child. Acting felt wrong. Deception felt cruel. So I simply did what felt honest. I gave him a small, trembling smile and curtsied deeply, just as I had been taught. "Father," I said, my voice soft. It was all it took. A broken sob escaped his lips. He rushed forward and pulled me into an embrace, his arms wrapping around me tightly. He was trembling. "My child," he wept into my hair. "My child, you have come home." Over his shoulder, I met Kaelin's gaze. His face was a mask of stoic control, but his eyes were filled with a turbulent mix of relief and profound guilt. We had done it. We had given this broken man a reason to hope again, and we had just sealed our fates with the most terrible lie imaginable. Being presented at court was like being thrown into a tank of beautiful, smiling sharks. The Grand Hall of Valoria was a breathtaking sight, with soaring vaulted ceilings, tapestries depicting ancient battles, and sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, painting the marble floors in jewels of color. But the beauty of the place was overshadowed by the people in it. Hundreds of lords and ladies, dressed in velvets and silks of every conceivable hue, turned as one to stare at me as I entered on the king's arm. Their faces were a mixture of shock, curiosity, and naked, calculating ambition. I wore a gown of deep cobalt blue, the color of the royal house, with silver thread embroidered along the neckline. Lyra had worked tirelessly on it, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever touched, yet I felt like a crow dressed in a peacock's feathers. My hands were sweating, and I could feel a tremor in my knees. Anil walked a few paces behind us, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his gaze sweeping the room. He was my guard, my protector, but his presence was also a constant reminder of the lie I was living. The king announced my return with a voice thick with emotion. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. I had to smile, to nod, to look like a princess who was overwhelmed with joy at her homecoming, not a servant girl terrified of being exposed. The true test came in the form of Duke Valerius. He was an older man, impeccably dressed with a neatly trimmed silver beard and clever, watchful eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had been Aurelia's history tutor. Calin had warned me, and he was the most powerful man on the king's council. He approached us, bowing low, a smile playing on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Your Highness," he said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "A miracle. We had all but given up hope." He took my hand, his touch dry and cool. "You look well. The years have been kind, though you are quieter than I remember." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the first major hurdle. "The years change us all, my Lord Duke," I replied, using the calm, measured tone Elspeth had drilled into me. "I have seen much of the world, more than I ever wished to." He raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, we must speak of it. I should like to hear of your travels, and to see if you recall our lessons. Do you remember the tale of Queen Charlotte the Wise and the riddle of the three caskets?" It was a trap, a deliberate, pointed question designed to expose me. I had never heard of Queen Charlotte the Wise. The name was a cruel coincidence. Panic seized me. I could feel Calin tense behind me. My mind went blank. I was about to stammer, to fail, when a memory from my real life surfaced. It was something Thomas, the kitchen master, used to say when the young scullery boys would try to trick each other with riddles. I gave Duke Valerius a serene smile. "A princess does not answer riddles, Duke. She asks them." I gently withdrew my hand from his. "But I do recall you were always more interested in the political allegories of such tales than in their simple conclusions. Perhaps that is a discussion for another time. I find myself quite weary from my journey home." I had turned his test back on him, implying his question was a frivolous game unfit for the moment. It was a gamble, but it worked. A flicker of surprise, and perhaps a hint of respect, crossed his face. He bowed again, deeper this time. "Of course, Your Highness. Forgive my eagerness. Welcome home." He retreated back into the crowd, but I could feel his eyes on me for the rest of the evening, watchful and calculating. I had passed the first test, but I had also made a powerful enemy. My days settled into a strange, suffocating routine. I was no longer Charlotte. I was Aurelia. I had lessons in the morning, council meetings with the king in the afternoon, and formal dinners or events in the evening. I was never alone. Lyra was my constant companion, a quiet, reassuring presence in a world of protocol and performance. She helped me dress, arranged my hair, and most importantly, she listened. I couldn't tell her the truth, of course, but I could speak of my fears and frustrations in veiled terms, and she would offer a kind word or a sympathetic smile. We formed a fragile, genuine friendship in the midst of all the lies. Calin was the other constant. He was my shadow, always there, silent and vigilant. We barely spoke outside of our clandestine coaching sessions late at night. In those stolen hours, he would brief me on the day's events, explaining the political nuances I had missed, correcting my mistakes, and preparing me for the next day. These sessions were tense, charged affairs. We were co-conspirators, bound by our secret, and the forced proximity was becoming unbearable. The looming specter over everything was the arrival of Prince Alaric of Viridia. He was coming to see the resurrected princess for himself, and, if satisfied, to renew the betrothal and finalize the peace treaty. The entire deception was building towards this single point. Alaric is no fool, Kalen warned me one night. We were in the royal library, hidden among shelves of ancient scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of paper and dust. He has been educated by the finest minds in the known world. He is observant and shrewd. He will test you. Like Duke Valerius? I asked, my voice small. Worse, Kalen said grimly. Valerius suspects a lie. Alaric will be searching for the truth. You cannot simply deflect him with clever words. You must convince him that you are Aurelia in your heart and soul. He paced in front of me, agitated. We need to go deeper, not just facts and dates. We need to know how she felt, what she dreamed of. He began to speak of her then, not as a list of traits to be memorized, but as a person he had known, a person he had cared for. He told me how she would sneak out of the palace to buy honey cakes from a specific street vendor, how she had a secret passion for stargazing and knew the constellations by their ancient names, how she had once wept when a baby bird had fallen from its nest. He spoke of her with a quiet reverence, a deep and abiding affection that he tried to hide behind his stern demeanor. And as I listened, a strange jealousy began to stir within me. I was wearing her face, living her life, but I would never be the girl he remembered with such fondness. The night of the welcome feast for Prince Alaric, the pressure was immense. I was dressed in a gown of shimmering gold, a color chosen to project confidence and royalty. Diamonds glittered in my hair and around my neck, but beneath the finery, I was just a terrified servant girl. Prince Alaric was handsome, in a severe sort of way. He had dark hair, a sharp jaw, and intelligent, piercing blue eyes. He carried himself with an air of absolute self-assurance. He bowed before me, his eyes assessing me with unnerving intensity. "Princess Aurelia," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. "Your return is the most astonishing news our continent has heard in a decade. I must confess, I find it hard to believe." His directness was disarming. "Truth is often stranger than fiction, Prince Alaric," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Throughout the feast, he engaged me in conversation. He spoke of philosophy, of art, of military strategy. He was testing the breadth and depth of a princess's education. With Kyalan's relentless tutoring, I managed to hold my own, parrying his questions with rehearsed answers and carefully constructed opinions. But it was exhausting. I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a canyon. The true challenge came later. Duke Valerius, ever the serpent, cornered us near the gardens. "Prince Alaric," he said with his false smile, "you should ask the princess to tell you about the summer hunt of her 14th year, a most memorable event. She was awarded the silver arrow by your own father for her remarkable archery skills. Is that not right, Your Highness?" My blood ran cold. Kalen had never mentioned a summer hunt, or archery, or a silver arrow. It was another trap, more specific and more deadly than the last. Alaric turned to me, his eyebrow raised in polite inquiry. The entire court seemed to be holding its breath. Kalen was standing across the room, trapped in a conversation with another lord, his face a mask of helplessness. I was completely on my own. My mind raced. I couldn't pretend to remember. I couldn't invent a story. Valerius would have been there. He would know every detail. So I looked at Prince Alaric, and I let a genuine sadness cloud my face. "My Lord Duke has a cruel memory," I said softly. My voice barely a whisper. I looked down at my hands. "He speaks of the day before my mother, the Queen, took ill with the fever that would claim her life." I looked back up, my eyes shining with unshed tears. tears that were not entirely fake, born of sheer terror. I remember very little of the hunt itself. All I remember of that week is the scent of her lavender water and the sound of her struggling for breath. I gave the silver arrow to her, hoping it would be a charm. It was buried with her. I turned to Valerius, my expression one of pained accusation. I am surprised you would choose to remind me of such a sorrowful time, Duke. A hush fell over the group. My answer was perfect. It was emotional, personal, and utterly irrefutable. It painted Valerius as a boorish, insensitive clod. He paled, stammering an apology. Prince Alaric looked at me with a new expression, not just assessment, but sympathy. He had seen not just a princess, but a daughter who had suffered loss. Later that night, as I was walking back to my chambers, my mind still reeling from the close call, Kalen caught up to me in a deserted corridor. He grabbed my arm, pulling me into a shadowy alcove. "That was brilliant," he breathed, his face close to mine. "How did you know about the Queen Sep's illness?" "You told me," I whispered, my heart still pounding. "You said she died in the autumn of Aurelia Set's 14th year. A summer hunt would have been just before." It was a guess, a desperate one. He stared at me, his gray eyes searching my face in the dim light. "You are more than just a copy, Charlotte," he said, his voice full of a strange wonder. "You are clever. You are remarkable." The intensity of his gaze was a physical force, pulling me in. The space between us shrank until I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hand was still on my arm, his grip no longer forceful, but a warm, possessive touch. He was looking at my lips, my breath caught in my throat. This was the moment. The unspoken tension that had been simmering between us for weeks was about to boil over. He leaned in, his eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't name, and I leaned in to meet him. And then he flinched back as if he'd been struck. He dropped my arm, his expression shuddering, turning back to stone. "Forgive me, Your Highness," he said, his voice stiff and formal once more. "A momentary lapse. It will not happen again." He bowed sharply and was gone, his footsteps echoing down the long corridor, leaving me alone in the shadows, my lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss that never was. The line between Charlotte and Aurelia, between his duty and his heart, had been drawn again, sharper and more painful than ever before. He was right. It could never happen. I was a lie, and he was the keeper of that lie. And a princess, even a fake one, could never love her guard. The grand ball, meant to celebrate the renewed alliance between our kingdoms, was the culmination of everything. It was the final act of my performance, the stage upon which the fate of thousands would be decided. The great ballroom was a dizzying spectacle of light and sound. Thousands of candles burned in crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, golden glow over the swirling sea of brightly colored gowns and dark, formal tunics. An orchestra played a lively waltz, the music echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. Everyone of importance was there, their faces expectant, their whispers a constant, rustling hum beneath the music. I stood beside the king on the royal dais, a fixed, serene smile plastered on my face. I wore a gown of silver brocade that shimmered with every movement, and the heavy royal diadem of Aurelia was a cold, unfamiliar weight on my head. I felt like a doll, exquisitely dressed and utterly hollow. My eyes kept searching the crowd for Kalen. I found him standing near one of the marble pillars, rigid and imposing in his dress uniform. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in his gaze I saw the same suffocating tension that was strangling me. Then he looked away, his expression unreadable, his focus once again on his duty. Prince Alaric claimed the first dance, as was his right. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding me through the intricate steps of the waltz with effortless confidence. He did not engage in the usual pleasantries. His blue eyes were serious, searching. "You have charmed my delegation, and you have won the hearts of your people anew," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear over the music. "But peace is not built on charm. It is built on trust. And you do not trust me?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I do not know what to trust, he admitted, his honesty a sharp contrast to the duplicity of my own court. I see the face of Princess Aurelia. I hear stories of her wit, but there is a sadness in your eyes that the legends never spoke of, a caution. The Aurelia of my father's tales was a wildfire. You are more like a candle flame, bright but carefully guarded. His perception was terrifying. He was seeing through the performance to the frightened girl underneath. 10 years in a world that was not my own has a way of tempering a fire, Your Highness, I replied, forcing a note of melancholy into my voice. Perhaps I am no longer the girl of your father's stories. I pray you find that the woman I have become is one who values peace above all else. He seemed to consider my words, his expression thoughtful. Before he could respond, the music ended, and our dance was interrupted by Duke Valerius. He approached with 2 goblets of wine, his face wreathed in that familiar predatory smile. A beautiful sight, he declared, handing a goblet to each of us, the very picture of a hopeful future. A toast, shall we, to the lost princess, and to the memories only she could possess. It was happening. This was his final move, the public unmasking he had been planning all along. The air grew thick with anticipation. The nobles closest to us fell silent, their eyes wide with curiosity. Kalan started to move toward us, a thunderous look on his face, but he was blocked by a phalanx of other courtiers, all craning their necks to see the drama unfold. He was helpless. Valerius turned his full attention to me, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. Your Highness, in honor of this momentous occasion, I have been reminiscing. I was telling Prince Alaric just the other day about your naming ceremony, a curious affair. Your mother, the late Queen, chose your name for a very specific, very personal reason. A story she told only you and her closest confidants on the eve of the ceremony. Tell us, Princess, why did she name you Aurelia? The world seemed to stop. The music, the chatter, the rustle of silk all faded into a dull roar in my ears. This was the one thing Kaylin could never have prepared me for. A secret between a mother and her child. A memory buried with the dead. There was no history book, no tutor who could give me the answer. This was the end of the line. I looked at Valerius's smug face, at Alaric's waiting, watchful eyes, at the sea of curious nobles. I was trapped. My mind was a black, empty void. I had nothing, and in that moment of absolute despair, something shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it crystallized into a strange, cold calm. I was not Princess Aurelia. I was Charlotte, a scullery maid. And what did a servant know better than anyone? She knew how to observe. She knew the secrets of the great houses, not from lessons, but from listening at keyholes, from polishing silver while lords and ladies gossiped, from seeing the things they thought no one was watching. I had spent weeks in Aurelia's chambers, surrounded by her things. I remembered a small, worn book of poetry on her bedside table, its cover embossed with a golden sun. I remembered the sunburst motif carved into the headboard of her bed, embroidered on her old riding gloves. It was everywhere, a quiet, constant symbol. I took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, meeting Valerius's gaze over the rim of the goblet. It is a painful memory, Duke, I said, my voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority I didn't know I possessed, one I have not spoken of in a decade. But for the sake of peace, I will share it now. I turned to Prince Alaric. My mother was born in the southern provinces, where the sun is a harsh and constant master, but she believed that even in the brightest, most unforgiving light, there was goodness and growth. She believed that a true ruler should not be a shadow, hiding in the dark, but a source of warmth and clarity for her people. I looked around the silent ballroom. The evening before I was named, she took me to the highest balcony of the palace just before dawn. She pointed to the east, to the first hint of light breaking over the horizon. She told me that light was Aurelius, an old word from her homeland, meaning the golden dawn. She named me Aurelia because she wanted her daughter and her kingdom's future to be a new beginning. a promise that no matter how dark the night, the light would always return. It was a complete fabrication, woven from a handful of details and a desperate hope. I had poured all of my own yearning for a new beginning, for a sliver of light in my own dark life, into the story. I ended my speech and held my breath, waiting for the axe to fall. Duke Valerius's face was a mask of utter shock. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the color draining from his cheeks. It was in his eyes that I saw the truth. I had guessed right. Or rather, I had guessed so beautifully, so perfectly, that it was better than the truth. Prince Alaric was the one who broke the silence. He raised his goblet. "To the golden dawn," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, and he drank. A cheer erupted through the ballroom. The lords and ladies, swept up in the emotion of the moment, raised their own glasses. To the princess, to Aurelia. Valerius was forgotten, his plot shattered. He had tried to expose a fraud and had instead cemented my legitimacy in front of the entire court and our most important ally. His public humiliation was absolute. In the midst of the cheering, I saw Kalen. He was staring at me from across the room, and for the first time since I had met him, his mask of control was completely gone. His face was filled with raw, undisguised awe, relief, and something else, something so powerful and unguarded it stole my breath. It was love, naked and undeniable. The moment the ball concluded and the king retired, the adrenaline that had sustained me vanished, leaving me weak and trembling. Before I could escape to my chambers, Kalen was there. He grabbed my hand, his touch electric, and pulled me wordlessly through a side door, down a servant's corridor, and up a winding stone staircase until we emerged onto a deserted battlements, the cold night air, a shock against my heated skin. Below us, the palace gardens were still aglow with lanterns, but up here, there was only the moon and the stars and the biting wind. "Charlotte," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. He still held my hand, his grip tight, as if he were afraid I might disappear. "How could you have known?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "That story, it was so—" "I didn't know," I whispered. "I made it up. I saw the sun symbols in her room, and I guessed." He shook his head in disbelief. "No, that was more than a guess. That was you." He took a step closer, cupping my face with his free hand, his calloused palm warm against my cheek. "Tonight you weren't just playing a part. You were more of a princess than anyone in that ballroom. You were brave, and you were brilliant, and you saved us. You saved everything." The dam of restraint we had so carefully constructed for weeks finally broke. All the stolen glances, the unspoken words, the simmering tension erupted in a single desperate moment. His head dipped down, and mine tilted up, and his lips crashed against mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hungry and desperate and filled with all the fear and relief and forbidden longing we had both been suppressing. It was the kiss of two people who had been living a lie for so long that they were starving for a single moment of truth. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, losing myself in the feel of him, the taste of him. His armor was cold and hard against my body, but his kiss was warm and devastatingly real. When we finally broke apart, gasping for breath, the reality of our situation came rushing back in, cold and cruel. He was Sir Calonne of the Royal Guard. I was, in the eyes of the world, Princess Aurelia, the future bride of Prince Alaric, and in reality, I was Charlotte, the nobody from nowhere. "Kalen," I whispered, my heart breaking, "we can stit." "I know," he said, his voice thick with anguish. He rested his forehead against mine. His eyes closed. "Gods, I know. But I love you, Charlotte. I think I have, from the moment I saw you in that muddy yard. I hated myself for it. I hated what I was forcing you to do, but I couldn't stop it." Tears streamed down my face. "I love you too," I confessed. The words I had been terrified to even think finally spoken aloud. "But what are we supposed to do? What happens now?" He pulled back, and the night returned. his expression hardening with the weight of his duty. The passion of a moment ago was replaced by a familiar, grim despair. Now, he said, his voice flat and empty. Nothing happens. The treaty will be signed. The peace will be secured. You will be a princess, and I will be your guard. That is all we can ever be. He stepped away from me, leaving me cold and alone in the moonlight. He had spoken the truth, a truth more painful than any lie we had ever told. We had won the war for our kingdom, but in doing so, we had lost our own. The days that followed my triumph at the ball were the loneliest of my life. The treaty with Viridia was signed amidst great pomp and ceremony. I sat on a gilded chair beside my father, the king, and watched Prince Alaric and our ministers put their seals to the parchment that guaranteed peace for a generation. I was hailed as a hero. They called me Aurelia, the peacemaker. Bards were already composing songs about the lost princess who returned at the kingdom's darkest hour to save them all. The victory felt like ashes in my mouth. Every cheer, every bow and curtsy was a new bar on the cage that was being built around me. I had been so focused on surviving the performance that I had never truly considered what would happen if I succeeded. Now I knew. My success meant the end of Charlotte. She was to be buried forever beneath the weight of Aurelia's crown, and I was trapped in this gilded prison for the rest of my life. Duke Valerius was stripped of his titles and banished from court. He went quietly, but the look he gave me as he departed was filled with a venomous hatred that promised he was not finished with me. His disgrace, however, brought me no satisfaction. It was just another consequence of the tangled web I had woven. The worst part was Kylan. He was a ghost. He performed his duties as my personal guard with a cold, flawless efficiency. He was always there, a few paces away, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The man who had kissed me with such desperate passion on the battlements was gone, replaced once more by the stern knight I had first met. We were never alone. He ensured it. The silence between us was a screaming chasm, filled with the words we could no longer say, the love we had confessed and then immediately disowned. Sometimes, in a crowded room, our eyes would meet, and for a fleeting second, I would see a flicker of the same pain and longing that was hollowing me out from the inside. Then he would look away, and the wall would be back, higher and more impenetrable than ever. The king, buoyed by the peace and the return of his daughter, was a new man. His grief was replaced by a flurry of activity. He began making plans for the future, for the dynasty. His plans, of course, centered on me. One afternoon, he summoned me to the solar. He was beaming, a genuine, happy smile that made my stomach twist with guilt. "Aurelia, my dear," he said, taking my hands, "we have secured the peace, but now we must ensure it. Prince Alaric has been most impressed with you. He has formally requested to proceed with the betrothal, a wedding within the year. It will bind our two nations together forever. We will be strong. We will be safe." I stared at him, my blood turning to ice. A wedding, marriage to Prince Alaric. Of course, it was the logical next step. It was the entire point of the betrothal. But hearing the words spoken aloud, seeing the joyous expectation on the king's face, I felt the last of the air leave my lungs. I would be trapped not just for a few months, but for a lifetime. I would be the wife of a man I didn't love, the princess of a country I was deceiving, and I would have to watch the man I truly loved stand guard outside my door every single day. The prospect was a fate worse than death. "That is wonderful news, father," I managed to choke out, the lie tasting like poison. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my opulent chambers like a caged animal. The silk sheets on the bed felt like thorns. The fine tapestries on the walls seemed to mock me with their scenes of heroic lovers and fairy tale endings. I finally sought out the only real friend I had. I found Lyra in the sewing room, quietly mending one of my cloaks by candlelight. She looked up as I entered, her gentle face full of concern. "Your Highness, you should be sleeping." Tears I had been holding back for days began to fall. "I can sit," I whispered, sinking into a chair opposite her. "Lyra, what would you do if you were trapped? if you had to choose between your own happiness and the good of everyone else? She put down her needlework and looked at me, her expression full of a wisdom that went beyond her years. She didn't know my secret, but she could see my pain. When I was a girl, she said softly, my village suffered a terrible blight. We were starving. A wealthy merchant offered to buy my family's land for a pittance. It would have saved my parents from debt, but it would have meant we lost our home forever. My father refused. He said, there is no good for everyone else if it is built on the misery of one. He believed that true solutions can't be built on such a rotten foundation. Her simple story struck me with the force of a physical blow. True solutions can't be built on a rotten foundation. My entire existence at court, the peace treaty, the king's newfound happiness, it was all built on a lie. It was all built on my misery. It was rotten at its core, and a rotten foundation would eventually crumble. I looked at Lyra, my friend, the only person who had shown me uncomplicated kindness, and I felt a surge of clarity. I knew what I had to do. It was terrifying. It could get me executed. It could reignite the war, but the alternative, a slow, living death in this beautiful cage, was no longer an option. Thank you, Lyra, I said, my voice filled with a new, steely resolve. You have helped me more than you know. I left her and went in search of Kalen. I knew he would be on duty, patrolling the corridors outside my chambers. I found him near the west gallery, his back to me, staring out a window at the moonlit city. Kalen, I said. He stiffened but didn't turn around. Your Highness should be in your rooms. It is not safe to be wandering the halls. His voice was cold, formal. Stop it, I said, walking to stand beside him. Stop calling me that. My name is Charlotte. He finally turned to look at me, his face etched with pain. Don't sit, do this. It sits too hard. No, I insisted, my voice firm. What sips hard is living like this, lying to everyone, lying to ourselves. The king wants me to marry Prince Alaric. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. It was the only sign of the turmoil I knew was raging inside him. It is a wise political match, he said, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. It will secure the alliance. I won't do it, I said quietly. I can sit. I would rather die, and I will not build a life, a fake life, on this lie any longer. He looked at me, his eyes wide with alarm. What are you saying? You can sit back out now. Everything we Sif worked for, the peace is built on a rotten foundation, I said, echoing Lyra Sip's wisdom. It won't last, and I will not sacrifice my entire life for it. I took a deep breath, my decision solidifying into unshakable resolve. We are going to tell the king. We are going to tell him the truth. Kalen stared at me as if I had gone mad. He'll have us executed, you for fraud, me for treason. He will feel like the worst kind of fool, and his grief will turn to rage. Maybe, I conceded. But it is the truth, and we owe him that. We owe it to the memory of his daughter. We used her face, her life, to achieve our goals. We can't continue to dishonor her by perpetuating this lie. We will go to him together. We started this together, and that is how we will face the consequences. I reached out and took his hand. It was cold, but he didn't pull away. He looked from my hand to my face, and he saw the unwavering determination in my eyes. He had forced me into this world, forced me to be strong, to be a princess, and now I was using that strength to choose my own path. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Whatever happened next, it would be on my terms. It would be the truth. We stood before the king in his solar. The next morning, the room was filled with bright sunlight, a stark contrast to the darkness of our purpose. King Theron was in a fine mood, looking over architectural plans for a new monument to celebrate the peace. He greeted us with a warm smile that faltered when he saw our grim expressions. What is it? He asked, his brow furrowing. Sir Colin, You look as though you are facing a firing squad." Kalen took a breath, stepped forward, and knelt, bowing his head. "Your Majesty, I have failed you in my duty. I have committed an act of treason for which I am prepared to accept any punishment." The king looked from Kalen's Sips, bowed head to my pale, determined face. "Aurelia, what is he talking about?" This was my moment. My voice, when it came, was steady. "He is talking about me, father." Using the word felt like a final, painful twist of the knife. "He has not committed treason alone." I told him everything. I started with the mud and the carrots, with Kalen's desperate arrival at the estate. I told him about our journey, the grueling lessons, the constant fear. I explained the plot, born of a desperate need to protect the kingdom. I confessed that the story about the Golden Dawn was a fabrication, a guess born of observation and luck. I laid the entire deception bare, omitting nothing. I did not make excuses or ask for pity. I simply stated the facts. As I spoke, the king's face went through a storm of emotions. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which hardened into a cold, terrifying fury. The color drained from his face, and his hands clenched into fists on the great oak table. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Kalen remained kneeling, his head bowed, awaiting his sentence. The king's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, dangerous whisper. "You," he said, his gaze fixed on me, filled with a hurt so profound it was almost tangible. "You stood here, in this room. You let me hold you. You let me believe." He couldn't finish the sentence. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, and walked to the window, his back to us. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. The sight of his grief, so raw and real, was more terrifying than any outburst of rage. He was not just a king who had been deceived, he was a father who had been given his daughter back, only to have her stolen from him a second time. We waited in that terrible silence for what felt like an eternity. Kalen did not move. I stood my ground, my hands clasped in front of me, my heart pounding a funeral drum against my ribs. I had done the right thing. I clung to that conviction like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. Finally, the king's sobbing subsided. He took a long, shuddering breath and turned back to face us. The rage was gone, replaced by an infinite, weary sadness. "The treaty," he said, his voice hoarse. "Is the treaty valid?" Kalen looked up. "Yes, Your Majesty. It is signed and sealed. Prince Alaric believes in the returned princess. The alliance holds." The king nodded slowly, his gaze distant. He looked at me, truly looked at me, not as the ghost of his daughter, but as the young woman standing before him. He saw my fear, but he also saw my resolve. "You could have married him," he said, more to himself than to me. "You could have lived out this lie for the rest of your life. Why tell me? Why risk everything now, when you had already won?" "Because a life built on a lie is a prison, Your Majesty," I answered softly. "And because you deserved the truth. Your daughter, Princess Aurelia, she deserved the truth." He was silent for another long moment, studying my face. "You have her eyes," he murmured. I was not wrong about that. He walked back to the table and sank into his chair, looking suddenly ancient. "Sir Kalen, stand up. You are a fool, and you have committed treason. But you did it to save this kingdom. A motive I, of all people, must understand." He turned his tired eyes to me. "And you, Charlotte, you have more courage than half the knights in my guard. You have served this kingdom in a way no one else could have. You brought us peace, a peace built on a lie, perhaps, but peace nonetheless. I cannot execute the woman who saved us from a pointless war." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. "But you cannot stay here," he continued, his voice firming. "The world believes Princess Aurelia has returned. We cannot undo that without causing chaos and inviting the very war you prevented. But a wedding cannot happen. The lie would be discovered." He tapped his fingers on the table, his mind, the mind of a king, already working through the political puzzle. Princess Aurelia is unwell. The trauma of her lost years has taken its toll. She requires seclusion, a quiet life far from the pressures of the court. She will abdicate her claim to the throne, naming my nephew as heir. She will retire to a small private estate in the western provinces to live out her days in peace. He was creating a new story, a new final lie to cover the first one. He was giving me an escape. As for you, Sir Calin, the king said, a flicker of something almost like a smile touching his lips. Your guilt is palpable. I sentence you to a life of exile. You will escort Princess Aurelia's to her new home and serve as the captain of her household guard. You will ensure her safety and her seclusion. You will not return to Valoria. Is that understood? It was a punishment that was in fact the greatest gift he could have possibly given us. Freedom. Together. Kalan looked at me, his eyes shining with disbelief and dawning joy. Yes, Your Majesty, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I understand. 2 weeks later, we left Valoria. We rode out not through a secret postern gate, but through the main gates in a royal procession. I was in a covered carriage, playing the part of the frail, retiring princess one last time. The people lined the streets, their faces sad, to see their peacemaker princess depart. Once we were clear of the city, Kaelan rode up beside the carriage window. We're clear, he said, a genuine smile transforming his usually stern face. I pulled back the curtain. The city was a smudge on the horizon behind us. Ahead of us was the open road, rolling green hills, and an endless sky. I was no longer Aurelia. I was Charlotte again, and I was free. I left the carriage, and Kalen helped me onto the back of his horse. I wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my head against his strong back, breathing in the scent of leather and pine and freedom. We rode west, not towards a gilded cage, but towards a new life, a quiet one, an honest one, a life that was truly our own. And so my story isn't one of a servant who became a princess. It's the story of a girl who was forced to wear a crown, only to discover that her true worth had nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. I learned that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being terrified and doing what's right anyway. The peace I helped to forge was real, even if its foundation was a secret. But the most important thing I found was a truth that had nothing to do with kingdoms or politics. That love is not about who you are pretending to be, but about who sees the real you and chooses you anyway. It's been many years now. Kaylin and we built that quiet life. We have a small home, a garden where I grow carrots, and the peace we fought for has held. My name is Charlotte, and for the first time in my life, that is more than enough. Thank you for listening to my story. It's not always easy to share the most difficult parts of our lives, but I believe there's strength in it. Have you ever been forced into a role you didn't choose? How did you find your way back to yourself? I'd be honored to read your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if my journey resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you again for joining me. Remember that your own identity is the most valuable thing you will ever possess. Guard it well.